Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. And I'm excited today because I've got my usual sidekick, Sachin Patel. But we also have Mike Watson from Design Doctors Australia. And he can give you a little bit more detail as to what that's about. But I'm going to hand over to Sachin to run most of the show. Thanks, Sachin.
Welcome to the podcast by Scale My Clinic, founded by Doctors Todd Cameron and Sachin Patel, who are on a mission to help every general practice owner achieve his or her dream. The Scale My Clinic podcast is designed to leave listeners with insights and understanding gained by real lived experience that will help general practice owners create impact, get their time back, and enjoy increased revenue. Join Todd and Sachin every week as they share their stories on the Scale My Clinic podcast.
Cheers, Todd. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
So, it's a period of great change over the last, recent time, and you are mainly about designing and fitting out clinics. So I'd love to hear what, from your experience, is the current state of play in the clinic design and fit out space.
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't changed for a long time. We've still got the same things going on that were applicable 25 years ago. So what I've been working on is how post-pandemic, there's certain elements that need to change within a GP practice if they're going to get anywhere. They can be stuck in the mire of the last 25 years in that design, but going forward, we need to think about how we're going to live with mass vaccination and positive cases, which we accept. We're becoming to accept now that we can live with them on public transport here and there, but in GP clinics, previously they've always been turned away, but in future that's not going to be the case. And I think we've got to look at separate waiting areas. We've got to look at the air conditioning, the negative air pressure here and there. So just from a practical point of view, that's really changing. From a visual point of view as well, we need to make the practices just more appealing for people to come in there and really improve the experience of the patient.
And so, thanks for that. So maybe we might start with the practical elements. You talked very much about the space and the configuration and ventilation. So maybe you could help us think about how that applies to a new location and how it might apply to an existing location.
Yeah, I think in both cases, it's quite simple to implement as well. You often start down these paths and you think, wow, this is an unbelievable problem, but like, what's the solution? And you're going around and around and around to come up with a solution. And what I came up with was applicable to either and not expensive or inconvenient to install. In really just separating the people that can't tick all the boxes on the questionnaire. That we separate those into a separate area. They then have a separate, more clinical, disinfected consult room with negative air pressure. And then from there, they go into a separate part of the treatment room. And then from the treatment room, they go straight out by a separate entry. So it's quite easy to install even in existing practices.
And so obviously, so ventilation would be different, and a separate space perhaps for those that would be at risk of a respiratory illness. So
I think so. Yeah. I think so, and also in the consult room itself, maybe a paperless consult room, a sanitation area before you go in or just inside the door, etc. And the negative air pressure with a HEPA filter is the important one. And none of this is really expensive to install in an existing practice anyway.
So, the next question that listeners are going to have right now, or those who are viewing this, they're going to say it's not expensive. What does that mean?
If you've got an existing practice, the worst case scenario, HEPA filters, everyone thinks cost a fortune because you're looking at HEPA filters in an operating theatre. The HEPA filters start from $250 each, right? And can be installed on an existing outlet. So not too expensive means to incorporate the whole thing, you're probably looking at somewhere between $15,000 to $25,000 in an existing practice, worst case scenario. If you're doing it from new, of course, that's probably down to an extra $5,000 or $10,000 onto your fit out cost. So it's nothing.
Wow, that's really interesting. And so I think one of the things that springs to my mind is I think many people would be in a position where they think, oh, there's no point thinking about that because it's just going to be too complicated or too difficult.
Exactly.
What you're saying is the opposite.
Exactly. It's not complicated. It's not difficult. When I first looked at what we needed to do, really, and moving forward, if we needed to get out of the traditional method, and how we're going to approach the two areas, really, mass vaccinations, and the other is the respiratory disease. Mass vaccination is a different thing. That's more concerned with the workflow and the speed through the practice and then the entry and exit. But the positive cases, really, when I started down looking at that problem, it seems so complicated that, oh my God, what do I do? How do we solve this one? Is there a solution? But when you break it down and just analyze it, it is quite simple. It's not the foolproof method. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a lot better than what we have now.
Excellent. And I think it probably relates to getting expert advice, right? So yeah, I think that's really important. Someone who understands medical clinics and understands how the existing configurations are and where the modifications can happen.
Correct.
Todd had a question.
I think so Mike, this is really interesting from a business continuity perspective, isn't it? In that at this time in the pandemic, at the time that we're doing this, most clinics that have a patient come in are considered tier 1 exposure sites. And so if that's a Monday, when you've got all of the staff in the building, that means all of those people require 14 days of quarantine and testing. And of course, those rules may change in time. But, for most clinics that work on a margin of somewhere between 8 and 15%, 2 weeks of not being able to operate could be their profit for the year, right? So if you're in a high-risk area, and we see this, the cases, the outbreaks tend to cluster in areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. So there's often, the same clinic kind of comes up again and again. This is a big deal when you look at the cost. You're saying it's not expensive, but if it means that you can protect your business from being a tier 1 exposure site, that's a huge benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, if you've got any symptoms at all, you're not encouraged to go in, are you, at all? But definitely that's going to change once the vaccination rates are at a certain level. Things are changing. Quite a lot of things will change very quickly then. So I think at that stage, you need to be prepared for that stage. At the moment, I think anybody with symptoms are still going to turn away, and it's very unlucky if they do come in. But again, moving forward, different scenario altogether once we reach certain vaccination projections.
Thank you. And then the other element you were talking about is the need to modify and improve the patient experience and the visual appearance. And I suppose that applies to both patients and doctors, attracting doctors as well. Can you talk a bit more about the visual side?
Yeah, correct. I think from a patient point of view, I think there's three touch points that you need to focus on. One is the approach to practice. One is the waiting and reception area, and the other is the consult room itself. These are the three. These are the three exposure sites really to the patient that determine his perception of the services that he's going to receive. If he walks into the reception area or the waiting area and it looks terrible, he's expecting terrible service right from the get-go. Right. So these are 3 areas. Walking up to the clinic, how does it look? Signage, frontage, etc. Waiting area, reception area, is it friendly? Is it comfortable? And then in the consult room itself. And really the client's perception of the service he's going to receive is determined by those three points alone. But there's another factor that's come into play as well recently, which is the efficiency of the practice. It didn't matter before that you got people walking past each other in the corridor, but now we've got to think about that too. Maybe a separate entry and exit to treatment rooms. Maybe a consult room not all in one corridor. So there's a lot of factors now, and it's changing. But from a visual point of view, really focus on the 3 points and don't spend a lot of money on areas that you don't need to, that the clients don't see, like cupboards for the staff behind reception, or fancy door handles on the consult doors that don't mean anything to the client. But focus on those 3 areas really to improve the client's perception of the experience they're going to receive.
Absolutely. It's about focusing effort on the most important areas.
Yeah. And I hear when practices cost a fortune to design and fit out, it's because the efforts and the money hasn't been focused on these areas. It's just been splattered everywhere. So you walk into the consult room and there's very expensive cabinets behind, like for no reason whatsoever. A very expensive server cabinet, rather than focus on the three main areas.
And if and when you do that, so the next question, and people are always intrigued by cost.
Of course.
So that thought, I think, and we hear it quite often. Oh, a fit out is very expensive, and having a premium feel is very expensive. But when you think about it in a different way, in the way that you're describing, and it's a bit of a question of how long's a piece of string. But what is the cost impact of that if you focus in the right areas?
It doesn't cost any more because we're just not focusing on the areas that really don't matter. So just to give it a really rough idea of cost, what I'm finding is if we're fitting out a warm shell from scratch, a warm shell being it's got a ceiling, it's got air conditioning, it's got lights, but we've got to build the walls, furniture, etc., etc. That's costed between $1,300 and $1,600 per square meter, depending on the finishes. So it wouldn't matter if we spread that throughout the practice, or we really focus that on the 3 areas that really matter. Now, if it's a cold shell, i.e. there's no ceiling, there's no air conditioning, there's nothing, then you're costing anywhere from $1,600 to $2,000 a square meter. And unfortunately, a lot of your money is going into things that the patient's never going to notice, which is air conditioning and fire sprinklers, etc. So in negotiating a space, always try to make sure you've got a warm shell, that you've got some base to start with.
Excellent, thank you. So we might change gear a little bit. This is what you do. You're an expert in this field. You do this day in, day out, and you've done it for a long time. And so along that time, you must have come across when people have made a mistake or 2 or 3. And I'd love to hear, what are the 3 main mistakes that you come across that owners or would-be owners make, that you wish they would have spoken to you first, because you would have helped prevent that mistake?
The biggest one of all is signing a lease or purchasing a property that's just not suitable for medical. And I've had that before, unbelievably. A call from a client saying, Mike, I found this beautiful terrace in Paddington. Okay, so I'll go and have a look at this terrace in Paddington in the eastern suburbs, and it's all residential. There's absolutely no chance. So all they did was add that to their residential property portfolio, really, because they couldn't do anything with it. But then the credit is maxed out, so they can't do anything what they want to do. So one is check, and I always check for clients. There's no cost or obligation for this. I work with a private certifier that will always make a couple of calls, download a couple of forms for me, so we can see initially if there's likely to be any problem with the usage, and don't take anything for granted, because you think if you move into this beautiful office building, there's offices above, it's obviously commercial, etc., etc. You think you're going to be fine. Not necessarily. It could be that the council's changed its LEP recently, and it doesn't want commercial in that building anymore, and it only wants warehouses. in that area. So don't take anything for granted. Always check the usage. That's the biggest thing. The second thing, actually, the most common one is trying to separate, is getting too involved and trying to separate the appointing a designer, appointing a private certifier, going out to tender with separate builders, managing on site. Really, the cost of that is unbelievable for a doctor to take time out of his practice to try and manage all that process, you know. And then you've got competing interests between designer and builder. The designer's not particularly working to a cost, but the builder's working to a very tight one. So use one company as much as possible. Outsource the whole thing to one company, establish a budget and say, look, Mike, this is what I've got. This is what I want to do. Can we do it? And once you've got that, you've got one point of responsibility. It makes your life so much easier.
Thank you. One throat to choke.
Yeah, I love that one. That's perfect.
I might hand over to Todd here. I'm sure he'll have a couple of more questions to put to you. Over to you, Todd.
Yeah, I think just on that, Mike, there's one of my favourite books is a book by Keith Cunningham called The Road Less Stupid. And he says that everybody pays the dumb tax, and running a project for the first time and learning all of the kind of things that you've forgotten more about project management than most people could ever learn in the first 5 to 10. Like, it's just silly to pay that dumb tax and think that you might save some money. You're mostly going to get taken to the cleaners by experts that you're actually working with. So, as you say, I strongly am a fan of just going to one expert and saying, here we go, there's not going to be any problem with translation of the work, and you can just get regular updates on it, and do what you're good at in the meantime. That kind of makes sense for all of us.
Yeah, because I can guarantee it's going to cost more and take longer if you try and do it yourself. Absolutely guarantee. And I would get killed if I tried to if I tried to diagnose my own symptoms. A doctor would kill me, but he's doing exactly the same.
One of the presentations we did was, there's a guy that's got his dishwasher in pieces, and you just know that phone call to the repair person is going to cost a lot more than the first call, which is, hey, it doesn't work, can you come and sort it out? Rather than trying to fix somebody else's problems. It's always way more expensive. Hey, I'd love you to touch on when you and I spoke recently, you had some really elegant rules on the space. So let's pretend here that people that are listening, could be in various stages of ownership. They may already be owners, they may be potential future owners. But you had some really cool tips that in the time I've been in medicine, and I've done probably 12, 15 clinics that I've personally worked with the designer and done the layouts and stuff that were new to me. And so I'd love you to just give your kind of rules of thumb about when you see a space and you're processing it, what do you do? So the first rule of thumb is don't sign anything until you speak to somebody like you. Yeah. But what about assessing spaces? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I often you're going to need less space than you actually think you are, because you're probably in a practice now. If you're looking at setting up your own practice, you're probably in a scenario that has been there for 20 years, and you look at it and think, well, I've got 4 consults room. We've got 4 consults on a treatment in here, and it's 150 square meters. I want 6 consults, so I need 200 square meters. But not necessarily so. It really depends on the shape of the space that you're looking at. And the perfect space is a rectangle with no columns, with a ratio of about 3:1 maximum, and the entry door to one side on the front. So in that space, I've had situations where I've had 5 rooms and in 80 or 90 square meters, because it's been a perfect shape. So just look for something that's a rectangle. Look for something with no columns or only 1 or 2 columns, if possible. And the entry door towards one side on the left, either left-hand side or right-hand side at the front, but it doesn't matter. But rectangle is the way to go. Avoid any curves or beautiful looking pointy bitty buildings, star-shaped buildings or Burj Khalifa type things. avoid all that, go for the rectangle.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the sexy shapes, as you say, create compromises that cannot be overcome. And so, having a space inside that's beautiful. And I think it's important to remember that when people enter a space, they don't really know what shape it is. They're judging it by, as you said, those contact points. And I think that's really important. The entry point, the waiting room, and then the consult room, that's where all the money is, where the investment should be. I think it's worthwhile repeating those. So you said a rectangle 3-to-1, and ideally an offset entrance. And one really critical part of that is avoid any structural columns. Now, what we're not saying is remove structural columns because they're there for a reason. But obviously, there's usually differences in the layers in the building as to where they may be. And you just cannot have, you can't get away from the shapes that they force you to contort the space to.
That's right.
You can't hide it, right? So
no, but you definitely, if you go outside those parameters, which are the perfect parameters, you might never find them. But if you go outside those parameters, you're definitely going to need more space. So if you've got an L shape, for instance, you might need an extra 10 or 15 or even 20% more space. And considering real estate's going to be one of the biggest costs in the business, an extra 10, 15 or 20% is a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it's a real benefit that people have an expert like you that thinks about their pocket like that, because it would be easy to think, if I'm going to charge somebody dollars per square meter, I prefer that they rented out a bigger space, that they had a bigger space, or they bought a bigger space because I can charge more. And, that would be some people's suspicion. So when you've got somebody that says, actually, you know what, ignore that, go for a tighter remit, get a smaller space, and just completely optimize the use of that floor space, I think that's a pretty unique proposition, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Spend the money on the entry, the reception, and the consult rooms, and reduce the overall cost by not having such an inefficient space.
All right, that's been awesome. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Sachin, or we wind the session up?
No, I think that's awesome. I think there's probably a whole episode on the consulting space of the future. So I think that will be a future episode that we should do.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Yep, that sounds good. In fact, let's do one on each on the waiting room, the entry, just do a single session on just the type of things we should be considering there. I think that's a brilliant idea. Sure. Thank you, Mike. I'm grateful for your wisdom today. Mike Watson, Design Doctors Australia. Thank you, Sachin Patel, as always. You'll see the details of how to get in contact with Mike in the show notes from today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next podcast. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning into the Scale My Clinic podcast with Todd and Sachin and the team. For more information and to get the resources mentioned in this podcast, visit www.scalemyclinic.com.